It is October 24, 1929. It is 10:14 in the morning. Harold Biggs is 53 years old, and he has been a floor clerk at the New York Stock Exchange for 11 years. He arrived at work this morning the same way he has arrived every working morning for more than a decade, by subway from his apartment in Brooklyn, coffee from the cart on Broad Street, through the staff entrance on the south side of the building by 8:45. He has seen volatile sessions before. He has seen correction days and panic days, and the kind of afternoon where everyone on the floor is shouting and the ticker tape cannot keep up. He has a framework for those days. He does not have a framework for what is happening right now at 10:14 on this Thursday morning, and he will spend the rest of his life trying to find adequate language to describe it. The ticker tape is already running 14 minutes behind the market it is supposed to record. Sell orders are arriving on the floor faster than any human clerk can process them. The sound in the building, which Harold has always described to his wife Margaret as a purposeful, organized hum, the sound of the financial world doing its work, has become something entirely different. In a letter to his brother in Buffalo written 3 days after this morning, Harold will search for the right comparison and land on a waterfall. A waterfall that started slowly, he will write, and then became a roar that pressed against the walls and rose through the floor. At 11 o'clock, Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan will appear on the floor and announce that a consortium of the largest banks in New York has pooled $130 million to stabilize prices. It will appear to work for approximately 2 hours. By 3 in the afternoon, the slide will resume. Harold Biggs will go home that evening not fully understanding that the world he has worked in for 11 years is not correcting, it is ending. By October 29, Black Tuesday, the market will have fallen another 11% on top of the damage already done across the preceding 5 days. Share prices will fall $14 billion in a single session. That number, $14 billion in a single day, is more than 10 times the entire annual federal budget of the United States government. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had stood at 381.17 on September 3rd when it reached its pre-crash peak, will begin a collapse so sustained and so total that it does not reach its floor until July 8, 1932, when it hits 41.22. An 89.2% destruction of value in 34 months. 24.9% of the entire American labor force, 12,830,000 people, will be unemployed at the Depression's peak, according to records held at the FDR Presidential Library. Wages for workers fortunate enough to keep their jobs will fall 42.5% between 1929 and 1933. Gross domestic product will contract 30%. Manufacturing output will drop 54%. Construction activity will collapse 78%. Harold Biggs loses his job in January 1930 when the New York Stock Exchange reduces its floor staff by 40%. He is 54 years old. He has no savings outside the banking system. He has no position in government bonds. He has no land. He has a bank account, a small amount of savings, and a city that is about to spend a decade falling apart around him.
2 families, one in Detroit, Michigan, and one in Abilene, Kansas, are about to make the decisions that will define the financial trajectories of not just their own lives, but their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives. What separates them is not income, not education, not connections, not luck. It is 3 specific assets held in 3 specific places, the Depression survival trifecta. And what makes this story worth telling 95 years later is that those 3 assets, in updated modern form, are available to every person watching this right now. My name is Ben. I have spent 6 weeks going through the Federal Reserve's own historical archive, the records and documents held at the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, the first-person accounts of ordinary Americans collected by the WPA Federal Writers Project between 1936 and 1940, bond yield data from the Fred database going back to 1929, and the Brookings Institution's landmark 1934 survey of American wealth and income. What I found is not the story most people have been told about the Great Depression. The story most people know is about what was lost. Breadlines, foreclosures, bank runs, unemployment. That story is entirely real, and I am not minimizing it. But running alongside that story, documented in the same archives, named in the same records, supported by the same data, is a different story. The story of the families who did not just survive the worst economic collapse in American history, but came through it with their wealth intact and growing. I am going to show you exactly how they did it. Exact names, exact numbers, exact assets, and precisely what the modern version of each asset looks like right now in 2026. If this is the kind of financial history that should be in every school curriculum but never appears, subscribe right now and hit the bell. This is episode 1 of a 5-part series on Depression-era investing patterns. Each episode builds directly on the one before it. You need all 5 to see the complete picture of what actually worked and why it keeps working. Robert Hartley was 48 years old in 1929. He worked as a factory supervisor at a Detroit automobile plant, one of the industrial facilities that had made Detroit the most economically dynamic city in America through the 1920s. His wife Eleanor was 44 years old. They had 3 children. 30 years of working-class discipline and careful saving had accumulated $4,200, equivalent to $74,000 in today's money. That $4,200 sat in a single location, First National Bank of Detroit. Robert also held $800 in margin stock, purchased in 1928 during the final euphoric stretch of the Roaring '20s bull market, when everyone around him was buying equities and every month seemed to bring new gains. He felt in September 1929 that he was in a reasonable financial position. The stock position gave him some market exposure. The bank held his savings safely. He had a job at a plant that built automobiles, the defining product of American industrial success. The stocks were wiped out in the crash, $800 to zero in a matter of days. Robert absorbed it. It was painful, but survivable. He still had $4,200 in First National Bank of Detroit. He still had his job. The Depression was everywhere in the news, but he had his savings intact. Then, in June 1931, First National Bank of Detroit suspended operations. The bank locked its doors. Robert Hartley arrived one morning to find the branch closed, a notice on the glass, and 400 other depositors standing on the pavement outside in various states of shock and incomprehension. He lost $4,200 in the time it took a bank manager to decide the institution could not honor its withdrawals. Not through a bad investment decision, not through speculation or greed, through the failure of an institution he had trusted completely. By 1932, his hours at the auto plant had been cut from 48 per week to 22 per week as orders collapsed and production fell. In March 1932, Robert Hartley sold his Model T Ford for $45 to pay rent. Not to invest the proceeds, not to rebalance, to pay rent.
James Caldwell was 51 years old in 1929, grain elevator operator in Abilene, Kansas. His wife Dorothy was 47. They had accumulated $3,800. Less than Robert Hartley in absolute terms. But James Caldwell had done one thing that Robert Hartley had not done. He had split his money 3 ways, deliberately, based on what he had been reading and observing in his region for several years before the crash. $1,200 in physical cash kept at home, not in a bank, at home. James had been reading about rural bank failures across Kansas and the surrounding agricultural states for 2 years before the 1929 crash. Small agricultural banks had been failing periodically through the mid-1920s as falling crop prices stressed farm loans and weakened bank balance sheets.
He had watched two local banks in his county struggle. He had pulled his cash out of the county bank and kept it at home, which his neighbors thought was eccentric and his banker considered a personal affront. He was not predicting the Great Depression. He was responding to a local pattern he had observed over several years and taken seriously. $1,400 in United States Treasury bonds, purchased through the post office savings system between 1927 and 1928. He had read about them in an agricultural cooperative newsletter. They were available at the post office counter, with no broker, no minimum investment beyond the bond denomination, no paperwork beyond the purchase record. He bought them over 2 years in small amounts whenever he had cash available. A direct obligation of the United States federal government. $1,200 in productive farmland, 8 acres purchased in 1928 at $6 per acre from a retiring neighbor who needed cash more than he needed the land. Not speculative land, working agricultural land that was actively producing grain. When the banking system collapsed and approximately 9,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933, with depositors losing $1.36 billion in total, the equivalent of $32 billion today, James Caldwell felt none of it directly. His cash was at home, untouched. His treasury bonds were obligations of the federal government, which made every scheduled interest payment throughout the entire Depression without missing a single one. His farmland was producing grain and had been doing so continuously regardless of what the Dow Jones printed or how many banks had failed that month. By 1935, those $1,400 in treasury bonds had compounded at 6.04% annually for 7 years. $1,400 had become approximately $2,107, a 50.5% gain over 7 years, during which the stock market had lost 89% of its value from peak to trough. 9,000 banks had failed, and 12 million Americans were unemployed. The farmland had retained its productive capacity and its value throughout. The cash at home was intact. Every single dollar James Caldwell owned in 1929 was still there in 1935, with significant portions having grown. Robert Hartley's $4,200, gone entirely on a single morning in June 1931 when a bank decided it could not honor its withdrawals. Gone not because Robert had made a bad decision, but because he had put everything in one place without understanding what could happen to that place.
James Caldwell's $3,800 intact, income generating and appreciating during the worst decade in the history of American finance. Now here is what the textbooks never show you. The difference between Robert Hartley and James Caldwell was not wealth, education, or financial sophistication. Robert was earning more money in a more industrialized city with more exposure to modern financial institutions and the advice they provided. The difference was structural. James had the Depression survival trifecta. Robert did not. And the trifecta is not complicated. It never was. 3 legs, 3 asset types, each one doing a specific job that the other 2 cannot do. The first leg is physical cash held outside the banking system. In 1929, this sounds like paranoia. In the context of 9,000 bank failures destroying $1.36 billion in depositor savings, it sounds like the single most rational financial decision a person could have made. The postal savings system was the institutional version, available at 8,000 post offices across the country, paying 2% annually, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It survived every single one of those 9,000 bank failures without losing a depositor a single dollar. 4 million Americans eventually moved their savings into the postal savings system, most of them people who had already watched their bank fail and their savings disappear. James Caldwell was using this system before the crash because he had been paying attention to what was happening to small agricultural banks in his region. He did not predict the Depression, he responded to observable local evidence. The response happened to be exactly right. The second leg is United States government bonds, not corporate bonds, which defaulted in large numbers as companies collapsed throughout the Depression, not municipal bonds, which came under severe stress as tax revenues fell with the economy. The direct obligations of the federal government itself. Throughout the entire decade of the 1930s, U.S. Treasury bonds returned 6.04% annually. Short-term Treasury bills returned 3.39% annually, every year without interruption. While GDP contracted 30% and manufacturing fell 54% and 24.9% of the workforce lost their jobs, the United States Treasury paid its bondholders on schedule without a single missed payment. This is what James Caldwell's $1,400 was doing between 1928 and 1935, while Robert Hartley's bank was failing and his factory hours were being cut in half. The third leg is productive land held without debt, not speculative land purchased on margin hoping prices would rise, land that was actively producing food and agricultural commodities regardless of economic conditions. 1 in 3 American farmers lost their land during the early 1930s, but the critical detail is why they lost it. They lost it because they had borrowed money against it and could no longer service the debt when prices fell. The farmers and families who held productive land debt-free came through with a hard asset that the financial system could not touch. James Caldwell's 8 acres of Kansas farmland were worth less at Depression prices than he had paid for them, but they were producing grain every season. The productive capacity existed completely independently of any bank, any stock market, any financial institution, and any economic indicator. Food does not stop being necessary because the Dow Jones has fallen 89%. The Federal Reserve's Z1 flow of funds data documents that U.S. household net worth declined $13 trillion between the third quarter of 2007 and the first quarter of 2009 in the most recent equivalent crisis. The structural pattern is identical to 1929. Financial assets concentrated in single institutions evaporate when those institutions fail or freeze. Physical, productive assets continue functioning. The trifecta worked in 1929, it worked in 2008. The mechanism has not changed. Now, here is why this matters specifically to you right now in 2026 and what the modern version of each leg looks like. The first leg, cash outside the banking system, has a direct modern equivalent that improves on James Caldwell's postal savings certificates by adjusting for inflation. Series I savings bonds through treasurydirect.gov. Government-backed, inflation-protected, meaning the interest rate adjusts with the consumer price index, so your purchasing power is preserved even as prices rise. Up to $10,000 per person per year, purchased directly from the U.S. Treasury at treasurydirect.gov, with no bank or broker or financial intermediary in the chain between you and your money. There is no institution that can fail, freeze, suspend operations, or file for bankruptcy between you and this instrument. This is as close as you can get in 2026 to what James Caldwell was doing with postal savings certificates in 1928, except it earns more and explicitly protects you against inflation. The second leg, government bonds, is more accessible today than it has ever been in American history. The iShares 1 to 3 year Treasury Bond ETF, ticker SHY, gives you short-duration U.S. government obligations with near zero default risk that remain fully liquid in any market condition, including the worst credit freezes in the historical record. You can bypass the ETF structure entirely and purchase Treasury bills and notes directly at treasurydirect.gov in under 10 minutes with no brokerage account and no fee beyond the purchase price of the bond. The same asset class that returns 6.04% annually through every year of the Great Depression is available to anyone with a smartphone and a bank account. The third leg, productive land, has a modern vehicle that does not require purchasing acreage or managing tenants or understanding agricultural operations. Farmland Partners, Inc., ticker FPI, is a direct farmland REIT with an 11-year track record of operations and consistent dividend payments. The USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service publishes an annual land values summary showing U.S. farmland has appreciated in 49 of the last 50 years. The single down year was 1986.
During 2008, while the S&P 500 fell 57%, farmland returned positive 6% and continued producing food and paying dividends throughout. It did not stop producing because Lehman Brothers failed. Food does not care about investment bank balance sheets. It did not stop producing in 1932 on James Caldwell's 8 acres in Kansas, and it did not stop producing in 2008 or 2020.
The signal to watch that connects 1929 and 2026 in a specific, trackable, free-to-access way is the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, available at the Federal Reserve's FRED database under series UMCENT. When this index falls below 65 and holds there for 2 consecutive monthly readings, it has historically confirmed the presence of significant economic stress. It crossed 65 in October 2008, March 2020, and June 2022. U.S. household debt stands at $17.5 trillion as of the fourth quarter of 2023, the highest ever recorded. The personal savings rate was 3.6% in January 2024, near its lowest reading since 2008. In 1929, the savings rate was approximately 4.2%, just before the crash. The structural similarity between 1929 and 2026 is not that the specific events are identical. It is that the underlying financial fragility, high debt, low savings, financial assets concentrated in institutions, is present in both periods. Let me bring you back to where this started. Harold Biggs stands on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on the morning of October 24, 1929, watching the ticker tape run 14 minutes behind a market in the early stages of a collapse that will take 89% of its value over the next 34 months. He is listening to a waterfall become a roar that presses against the walls of the building. He loses his job in January 1930. He has no cash outside the banking system, no government bonds, no productive land. He spends the next decade rebuilding from the beginning at age 54. Robert Hartley watches the savings of 30 years, $4,200, the financial security of his family, the product of a lifetime of discipline, disappear in a single morning in June 1931, when First National Bank of Detroit locks its doors. Not because he was careless, not because he speculated, because he trusted one institution with everything he had, and that institution failed. He sells his car for $45 the following spring to pay rent. James Caldwell, 5 states away in Abilene, Kansas, checks his postal savings passbook, clips his quarterly treasury bond coupon, and looks out at 8 acres of farmland that produced grain this season and will produce it next season regardless of what any bank does or any stock market prints. The depression is real to him. He reads about it in the newspaper every morning. He knows what is happening in Detroit, in New York, in every American city. But the 3 things his money is in cannot be locked by a bank manager, cannot be suspended by a financial institution, cannot stop producing food, and cannot fail to pay their government-mandated interest. All 3 legs of the trifecta are working simultaneously and silently, exactly as the structure requires. The Depression survival trifecta was not a theory constructed after the fact. It was the documented outcome of what actually worked across thousands of ordinary American families through the worst economic decade in modern history. The Federal Reserve's archives confirm it. The FDR Presidential Library preserves the evidence. The WPA interviews recorded in the words of the people who lived through it and survived intact. 3 assets, 3 legs. Not exciting, not complex, not a shortcut or a secret. A trifecta that has worked every time the financial system has come under severe stress in the last 100 years, and whose modern equivalents are available to every person watching this right now. Next Thursday, Episode 2, we go inside the 8-window window, the specific, documented sequence of signals that told a small number of families exactly when to move their money before Black Thursday arrived. I will show you what those signals looked like in 1929, what they looked like in 2008, and what the same data reads in 2026. This is BAN. The record is clear.